You've looked in the mirror thousands of times, but have you ever truly met the one looking back? In fairy tales, the mirror is never just glass. It's a summons, a demand, a silent question posed to the ego. Is this really all you are? Reflections appear at moments of crisis, when the hero is divided, when the old identity no longer holds. The mirror exposes the fracture between the life you're living and the life that's been waiting. What stares back is not a monster, nor an idealized self. It's something far more unsettling, your unrealized potential, distorted by fear, expectation, and adaptation. Today, we're stepping into that reflective space to understand why fairy tales force their characters to face mirrors, why wholeness always begins with discomfort, and why the ego resists the very image that could make it complete. Because the mirror was never meant to flatter you, it was meant to tell the truth. In fairy tales, the first encounter with the mirror is never accidental. It doesn't happen in moments of confidence or clarity. It appears when something inside the protagonist has already begun to crack. The hero pauses, the noise of the world softens, and suddenly there it is, a surface that reflects but does not reassure. This first glance is not about appearance, it's about recognition. What the mirror offers is not an image, but attention, a subtle wrongness. The unsettling sense that what you see is both you and not you. Psychologically, this moment marks the beginning of inner division becoming conscious. Until now, the self could pretend to be whole, functional, adapted, but the mirror introduces doubt. In many fairy tales, the reflection is delayed. The character hesitates before looking, because some part of the psyche already knows, once seen, it cannot be unseen. The mirror exposes the distance between the ego, the identity shaped by survival, roles, and expectations, and something older, deeper, and less compliant. Not better, not purer, just more true. And that truth often arrives distorted. The reflection might appear darker, weaker, older, or strangely unfamiliar. This distortion is not a flaw of the mirror. It is a revelation of the inner tension that has been held out of awareness. We modern minds tend to think distortion means error. Fairy tales think otherwise. They suggest distortion is how the unconscious speaks when direct language would be unbearable. At this stage of the journey, the mirror does not ask for change. It asks for honesty. Can you tolerate seeing yourself without explanation, without improvement plans, without the comforting story of who you believe you are? Most protagonists fail this test at first. They look away, they deny the reflection, or they project its discomfort outward, blaming fate, enemies, or circumstance. And this is crucial. The first glance into the mirror does not awaken transformation. It awakens resistance. The ego stiffens. It feels exposed, threatened, because the reflection hints that the life being lived may not be the life that fits. This is why fairy tales place mirrors at thresholds, castles, forests, locked rooms. They signal that an inner crossing is approaching, whether the hero consents or not. For the viewer, for you, this moment asks something quiet but profound. Where in your life have you sensed that subtle misalignment, that feeling of being recognizable, yet incomplete? The mirror doesn't accuse, it waits. And the first glance is not about courage. It's about staying present long enough to feel the discomfort of truth begin to surface. Because no fairy tale ever moves forward until the reflection has been seen. The discomfort doesn't come from what the mirror shows. It comes from what it disrupts. In fairy tales, the reflection rarely reveals something shocking at first glance. There is no sudden horror, no dramatic revelation. Instead, there is a quiet unease, a sense that something doesn't align. And that subtle misalignment is precisely what unsettles the ego. The ego survives by coherence, by maintaining a story that explains who you are, why your life looks the way it does, and why certain doors remain closed. It prefers continuity over truth, adaptation over depth. The mirror threatens this arrangement. When the protagonist looks into the reflective surface, the image doesn't confirm the identity they've been living from. It introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity is intolerable to a psyche built on certainty. This is why the reflection feels intrusive. It doesn't attack. It questions, silently. Psychologically, the discomfort arises because the mirror exposes a gap between adaptation and essence, between the self that learned how to belong and the self that never fully agreed to the terms. What stares back is not an enemy. It is an unnegotiated part of the soul. And unnegotiated parts carry tension. They hold impulses that were postponed, talents that had no place, instincts that were deemed impractical, dangerous, or inconvenient. The ego feels this immediately, not as insight, but as threat. That's why fairy tale characters often react defensively. They dismiss the reflection, they rationalize it, or they become irritated, ashamed, or oddly angry without knowing why. The mirror destabilizes the hierarchy inside the psyche. Until this moment, the ego has been in charge, deciding what matters, what is possible, what must be ignored. The reflection suggests that authority may be provisional. And this is deeply uncomfortable, because if the image is true, even partially true, then something must change. And change means loss. Loss of certainty, loss of identity, loss of the familiar self. Fairy tales understand this fear. They do not shame it, they stage it. The discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is evidence that the mirror is working. At this stage, the reflection does not demand action. It demands endurance. Can the protagonist remain with the unease without fleeing into explanation? Can they resist the urge to fix, justify, or suppress what has been seen? Most cannot. Not at first. That is why the mirror often appears more than once in these stories. The psyche needs repeated contact before it can tolerate truth without collapse. For the modern listener, this chapter is painfully familiar. You sense the discomfort when your life looks successful, yet feels strangely hollow. When your choices make sense, but don't feel alive. When you recognize yourself, and still feel absent. The mirror doesn't cause this fracture. It reveals it. And the discomfort is not a warning to look away. It is an invitation to stay, long enough for the deeper question to form. Not, what's wrong with me? But what part of me has not yet been allowed to exist? That question is why the reflection feels uncomfortable, and why the story cannot turn back once it appears. In fairy tales, the mirror is never the destination. It is the doorway. Once the reflection has been seen, the story changes direction. Something irreversible has begun. A threshold is not simply a line between two places. It is a point of no return. A moment where staying the same becomes more dangerous than moving forward. This is why mirrors in folklore often appear at borders. The edge of a forest, a sealed chamber, a forbidden room. They mark the transition between a life that is merely functional and a life that demands truth. The mirror does not force the crossing. It only reveals that a crossing exists. Psychologically, this is the moment when awareness turns inward. Before the mirror, the protagonist's struggles could be blamed on the world, circumstances, other people, bad luck. After the mirror, those explanations begin to feel thin. The reflection makes it impossible to remain fully identified with the old story. The ego senses that something deeper is asking to be recognized, not someday, but now. This is why the mirror feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. Behind you is the known self, predictable, limited, safe in its compromises. Ahead is uncertainty, not chaos, but complexity. Crossing the threshold does not mean abandoning the ego. It means decentering it. The mirror shows that the ego is not the whole psyche, only a surface arrangement. A necessary one, but incomplete. And this realization is destabilizing. Fairy tales portray this moment with hesitation. The hero lingers. Time slows. The world seems to hold its breath. because once the threshold is crossed, there is no guarantee of return. The psyche understands this instinctively. It resists not because it is weak, but because it is protective. Crossing means encountering forces that cannot be controlled, instincts, images, longings that were buried for good reasons. Not all of them are gentle. Not all of them are convenient. Yet fairy tales insist on something crucial. Wholeness does not come from avoidance, it comes from passage. The mirror, as a threshold, does not ask for perfection. It asks for willingness. Willingness to enter a dialogue with what has been excluded. Willingness to risk confusion for the sake of integrity. Willingness to let the old identity loosen its grip. For the modern adult, this threshold rarely looks dramatic. It appears quietly, as a sense of restlessness that won't fade, as a loss of meaning that success cannot repair, as the realization that the life you built no longer feels inhabited. The mirror reveals that these are not failures, they are signals. Signals that the psyche is ready for a deeper alignment. But readiness does not mean ease. Crossing the mirror threshold often brings disorientation. Old values falter, motivations shift, certainties dissolve before new ones form. Fairy tales never rush this passage. They respect its gravity, because what lies beyond the mirror is not a better mask. It is a more complex truth. And once the threshold is seen, the question is no longer if you will cross, only how consciously you are willing to do it. In fairy tales, mirrors rarely tell the truth cleanly. They bend it, warp it, fracture it into something unsettling. The reflection is off, slightly wrong in a way that cannot be ignored. This distortion is not a trick of magic. It is a psychological statement. The psyche does not lie directly. It distorts, and it distorts precisely where truth has been suppressed for too long. In these stories, the hero often recoils from what they see. The face looks unfamiliar. The body appears diminished or exaggerated. The eyes seem older, colder, or strangely vacant. We might be tempted to think the mirror is deceptive, but fairy tales suggest the opposite. The distortion reveals the cost of inner compromise. Every time a person adapts against their nature, something bends. Every time a truth is postponed, something twists. Every time an instinct is silenced, the image of the self loses coherence. The mirror shows this accumulated tension. Inner lies are rarely spoken aloud. They are lived. I'm fine with this life. This is just how things are. It's too late to change. This is who I am now. These are not conscious deceptions. They are survival agreements, and the psyche honors them until it no longer can. That is when distortion appears. The reflection does not accuse the ego of wrongdoing. It exposes imbalance. Fairy tales understand that the ego needs illusions to function. We cannot live in constant depth. We need roles, routines, and simplifications. But when these illusions harden into identity, they become inner lies. And lies, even necessary ones, demand psychic energy to maintain. Distortion is the signal that the energy cost has become too high. The mirror shows what the ego refuses to say, that something essential has been misshapen by accommodation. This is why the reflection often feels humiliating, or shame-inducing, or quietly devastating. It reveals not moral failure, but self-betrayal, and the ego hates this realization, because to admit distortion is to admit loss, lost time, lost vitality, lost possibilities. So the psyche does what it always does when threatened. It rationalizes, it minimizes, it projects. The hero blames the mirror, or the magic, or the world, anything but the internal arrangement that produced the image. But fairy tales are patient. They allow the distortion to linger. Because distortion, unlike denial, has a direction. It points toward what wants to be restored. The warped reflection is not telling the hero who they are. It is showing who they have become by not being who they are. This distinction is crucial. The mirror does not condemn, it diagnoses. And diagnosis, in the language of myth, is the beginning of healing, not the end. For the modern listener, distorted reflections appear everywhere. in the exhaustion that success cannot explain, in the resentment that arises without a clear target, in the sense of living someone else's rhythm. These are not personal flaws. They are psychological distortions asking for attention. The mirror does not demand that you shatter the illusion immediately. It only asks that you stop calling distortion normal, because once the inner lie is seen, it can no longer protect you, and the reflection will keep returning until the truth it carries is finally faced. In fairy tales, there comes a moment when the mirror no longer shows distortion alone. Something else appears, a presence. The reflection deepens, and the image begins to feel inhabited, as if someone has been waiting behind the glass all along. This is the encounter the story has been moving toward. The hidden self is not a stranger created by imagination. It is familiar in a way that is unsettling, recognizable, yet long neglected. It carries the weight of what was set aside in order to survive. In psychological terms, this meeting does not introduce something new. It reintroduces something old. The self that wanted differently. The self that felt too much. The self that didn't fit the available roles and learned to retreat instead of disappear. Fairy tales do not romanticize this encounter. The hidden self is rarely gentle at first. It may appear wounded, angry, silent, or disturbingly alive compared to the controlled surface personality. This is because what has been hidden has not been allowed to mature. It has been preserved, not developed. Time passes for the ego, but it stands still for what is exiled. When the protagonist finally meets this inner figure, the reaction is often fear, not because the hidden self is dangerous, but because it carries truth without compromise. It speaks in impulses, images, longings, and emotions that resist rational control. The ego feels exposed. Meeting the hidden self means realizing that the current identity is partial. Functional, yes, but incomplete. This is why fairy tales frame the encounter as sacred, forbidden, or dangerous. Not because the hidden self is evil, but because it threatens the balance the ego has carefully constructed. And yet, something vital happens in this meeting. Energy returns. The story begins to move again. The hero feels more alive, even if that aliveness comes with conflict. This is a crucial distinction. The hidden self does not arrive to make life easier. It arrives to make life more real. It carries instincts that were postponed, creativity that had no outlet, strength that was never trained. And it also carries grief for the unlived life, for the years spent adapting instead of listening, for the parts of the soul that waited in silence. Fairy tales allow this grief to exist without resolution. They do not rush integration, because meeting the hidden self is not a merger, it is a relationship. The ego must learn to listen without domination, to negotiate without repression, to tolerate inner tension without fleeing back to comfort. For the modern adult, this meeting often feels like contradiction. You feel called towards something you cannot yet explain, drawn to changes that unsettle your stability, moved by longings that don't align with your current life. These are not signs of confusion. They are signs of contact. The hidden self does not demand abandonment of responsibility. It demands recognition, to be seen, to be named, to be given a place in the inner conversation. Fairy tales insist on this truth. No transformation occurs until the hidden self is met face to face, not as an enemy, not as an ideal, but as a living part of the soul that refused to die. And once that meeting happens, the story is no longer about reflection. It becomes about integration. In fairy tales, integration is never a dramatic fusion. There is no sudden harmony, no moment where everything clicks into place. Instead, integration begins quietly, almost disappointingly so. After the hidden self has been met, the mirror changes its role. It no longer shocks, it no longer accuses, it observes. Integration is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming less divided. What the mirror now reflects is not an ideal image, but a living tension held consciously. The ego remains, but it is no longer alone. This is where many misunderstand the process. Integration does not mean acting on every impulse. It does not mean abandoning responsibility or dismantling the life you've built. Fairy tales are careful about this. To integrate is not to obey the hidden self, it is to include it. The ego must learn a new posture, not control, not suppression, but dialogue. This is psychologically demanding. The ego has spent years, sometimes decades, organizing life around what was acceptable, rewarded, or necessary. Integration asks it to loosen its certainty without collapsing, and that takes time. In the stories, this phase is marked by discipline, by trials, by learning how to carry contradiction without resolving it prematurely. The protagonist must hold opposing truths at once. I am who I have been, and I am more than that. This tension is not pathology, it is maturation. Integration does not remove conflict. It relocates it from the unconscious into awareness. What was once projected outward, onto others, circumstances, fate, is now felt inwardly, and this can feel heavier at first. But something crucial shifts. Energy that was bound in repression begins to return. Vitality increases, meaning sharpens. The person becomes more present in their own life. Fairy tales often symbolize this through subtle changes. The mirror no longer distorts. The reflection steadies. The image becomes clearer, not perfect, but aligned. This clarity is not self-esteem, it is self-recognition. You stop asking, "Who should I be?" and begin asking, "What is asking to be lived through me?" Integration also brings humility. You realize how much of your identity was provisional, how many choices were shaped by fear rather than conviction, how often you mistook adaptation for character. This is not a reason for self-judgment. It is a sign of psychological adulthood. The integrated self is not louder, it is quieter and more grounded. It does not need constant validation. It does not require constant explanation. It moves with a different rhythm. For the modern adult, integration often shows up as restraint rather than expression. You say no more clearly. You stop overperforming. You feel less compelled to prove who you are. And paradoxically, you feel more real. Fairy tales end this phase without triumph. Because integration is not an end point, it is a way of living in ongoing conversation with oneself. Becoming what you see in the mirror does not mean fixing the image. It means inhabiting it, fully, responsibly, without pretending that wholeness means simplicity. The mirror no longer demands transformation. It reflects a self that can finally bear its own complexity. In fairy tales, there is a quiet moment that often goes unnoticed. The mirror is no longer mentioned. It doesn't shatter. It isn't destroyed. It simply fades from the story. This disappearance is not a loss. It is a sign. The mirror was never meant to remain. It existed for a specific psychological task, to bring awareness to division. Once that task is fulfilled, its presence is no longer necessary. When the mirror disappears, it means the psyche no longer needs an external surface to recognize itself. The protagonist has internalized the function of reflection. This is subtle, but profound. Earlier in the journey, identity depended on contrast, on comparison, on seeing oneself against an image. Now, something has shifted. The self no longer needs to be measured. It is lived. Fairy tales suggest that when integration deepens, self-consciousness softens. The constant inner commentary quiets. The need to monitor, evaluate, or correct oneself loosens its grip. This is not numbness. It is presence. The disappearance of the mirror signals a return to immediacy, to being inside life rather than watching oneself live it. Psychologically, this is the moment when inner dialogue becomes embodied. Values are no longer debated endlessly. They are enacted. The ego is no longer preoccupied with identity maintenance. It has learned to trust the internal relationship it has formed, and this trust changes everything. Decisions feel simpler, not because they are easier, but because they are less divided. Actions carry weight without excessive justification. Silence becomes more tolerable. Fairy tales often mark this phase through movement. The hero leaves the reflective space and continues the journey. There is work to be done, relationships to be tended, a life to inhabit. The mirror disappears because attention turns outward again, but now from a different center. For the modern adult, this phase is often mistaken for stagnation. There are fewer dramatic insights, less emotional turbulence, fewer revelations, but something essential has stabilized. You are no longer searching for yourself. You are responding from yourself. The question is no longer, who am I? It becomes, how do I live what I know? This is why fairy tales rarely end with self-discovery alone. They end with return to the village, the kingdom, the ordinary world. Integration must be lived where life actually happens. The disappearance of the mirror does not mean the end of growth. It means growth has changed its form. You will still encounter difficulty, still face loss, still be challenged, but the struggle will no longer be about permission to exist. The mirror is gone because you no longer need to ask for confirmation. You carry your reflection within you now, and that is why the story can finally move forward, not toward perfection, but toward a life that feels inhabited from the inside out. Where in your life have you been living from a reflection instead of from presence? Which version of you learned how to function, but never quite learned how to feel at home? If the mirror were to appear again, not to accuse you, not to flatter you, but to tell the truth, what part of yourself would you hesitate to recognize? And more importantly, what has that hesitation been costing you? If this reflection resonated with you, I invite you to stay with this work. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and join this ongoing exploration of fairy tales as maps of the adult soul. These stories are not meant to be consumed. They're meant to be lived with. Thank you for walking this path with me today. More journeys are coming, and next time, we'll step even deeper into the symbols that still know how to speak to you, if you're willing to listen.